1. Shanaki. Cool air caressed Shanaki's face as she rested, her boat drifting through the first light of early dawn. She had come to the river, in the face of much complaint from her guards, to escape the bustle and noise of the Bajok village markets. Recent events had left little time for respite, and she craved the peace of her Yaseti streams. With hope of home far from her, she had settled for what the locals called a river. This muddy, shallow thing with banks beset by weeds and silt dulling the moonlight glow against the water's surface. Yes, I am far from home. Shanaki, princess of Yaseti and second heir to its people, sighed. When she had learned of this land and had been told she would journey here to secure new alliances for her family and her people, she had been excited. Long had she yearned for a chance to escape the tiresome routine of palace life, for a chance to actually see the world to which she belonged. She could finally spread her wings and sample the different wonders life had to offer. Instead, she had spent weeks confined to a caravan, traveling along dirt roads and dirt plains. When she had heard the tale of the great Bajoki lands and their rich heritage, she had expected, well, she wasn't sure what she had expected. Certainly more than this. The same could be said for her husband-to-be. Baako was his name, first heir to Bajok, a striking man, chiseled and strong, and a dreadful bore. It really was a special talent for someone to manage that with her. She had long taken personal joy in listening to others and hearing their stories. It was the only way she ever got to really see life beyond the palace walls. Not that it had always been that way, of course. She had originally set out merely to test herself, practicing skills on her servants and guards that would prove useful for the dignitaries and diplomats to follow later in life. All those fake smiles and false words. But she had quickly grown to appreciate the brief glimpses of life they all had to offer. They had such freedom, yet they seemed to take it for granted. Her personal guard especially. Their stories helped pull her from the pits of boredom she so often found herself trapped in. The bonds she had gradually forged through hearing their tales were all that kept her sane these days. At least they usually did. In your own time, Kasa, I can feel you're itching to say something back there. The two she had brought with her this morning were not especially vibrant characters, but they were interesting enough in their own simple ways. There were keen differences between them. Their age, for one. Inake was one of her longest-serving guardsmen, steadfastly loyal, to a fault, she would say, though her father would not. He'd been with her since she was a babe, barely out of her mother's belly. Kasa was a recent addition to her retinue and had been very enthusiastic whenever they shared in conversation. Shanaki waited with bated breath until the shuffling behind her stilled suddenly, and she sighed. Damn it, Anake. He had an irritating habit of holding the younger among her personal guard back, telling him in no uncertain term to stop bothering the princess. There were times when that was appreciated. After all, too much familiarity from the stripling simply wouldn't do. But she'd give anything for someone to break this current silence. It was worse than the noise of the village. Where's Naya when I need her? She asked herself softly, stretching her head back on her shoulders and looking up at the waning night sky. True dawn would be upon them soon. Then, not long after that, a return to Bajok. I'm sorry, Your Highness. Shanaki sighed dismissively. It's nothing, Enake. She sat there a long while, simply staring out at the canvas of stars. Her patience ran dry as her neck began to strain. It seemed she would have to take things upon herself again today. So, what do my royal guardsmen think of the great plains of Bajok and its people? She did not turn to them, instead leaning forward from her recline to make a show of setting her rod back in its hoop, her eyes fixed on the waters ahead. It was beneath her as conversation starters went. She knew perfectly well what the two of them thought of the Bajoki. They thought them boorish, uncivilized, and beneath the Yaseti in almost every way. They just had a knack for holding on to the old magics. That was all. They had some secret way of clinging to the powers of their empire past. The way a creeping vine wraps around a sturdy baobab. She knew they knew this, and they knew she knew it too. But they would never voice such thoughts aloud without prompting. They were well trained. Inake, however, took her question for the invitation it was. Princess, Shanaki for today, I think, Inake. It's just us friends here after all. Princess Shanaki, he continued. Shanaki laughed to herself. He'd never change. I think you know I had hoped for a more illuminated new home for you than this. She could hear the deep frown his words were working through without having to look. For Inake, that was practically an enraged curse. She had to stifle her smile. He'd hear it in her voice as well as she had his frown. You don't want to move you and your wife out here then? Princess, I am your sworn protector. Where you go, I shall follow, for as long as I am able and you allow it. His voice was indignant, as though she might doubt him, as if she ever could. Twisting around and giving him a warm smile, she responded, And what of Tenota? I'm not sure she'd appreciate being uprooted so. Least of all to live here in this unilluminated place. Inake faltered at that just a bit. She would understand. She knew who she bound herself to a long time ago. And she is most fond of you, Your Highness. Shanaki smiled widened and warmed further still. She was fond of Tenota herself. She was an aunt to Shanaki, in name, if not by blood. Family. She turned her head to Kasa, who was sitting dutifully quiet as his senior and his lady spoke of bonds he was far yet from forging for himself. She raised an eyebrow, and he sat silent for a moment, clearly growing uncomfortable under her questioning gaze. She relented as she felt the twinges of awkwardness herself and turned back to her vigil at the boat's bow. I don't think it would be so bad here, Your Highness. Shanaki. She heard the young man cough briefly and pictured a nervous sidelong glance from a disapproving Inake. He continued. But I've not made my vows yet. And while I'd be honored and willing, truly, my family. She was slightly surprised at the nervousness. Kasa had always been confident and bold. This was a new color on him. You need not worry, Kasa. As you say, you have not yet made your vows. You are not sworn to me. I would not force you to follow even if you were. Your place is back home where little Temsi and Balo can grow tall and strong and bright. She looked across the water to a patch of brown bush, its dim branches lilting in the rising sun. They would wither here. She paused again, pondering whether to continue. Besides, I do not think I shall be staying in Bajok for long. A splash of water erupted at her side. She glanced left before, Princess! A blur of black rushed at her from the riverbank, running, not through the water, but atop it. What? The figure leaped overhead, cold droplets of water raining down on her face as she followed its shadowed arc. It twisted impossibly in the air, limbs darting every which way, blurring the last of the dawn-defiant stars still above. The boat rocked as the figure landed. A man, dark-skinned, and wrapped in the yet darker skins of some unknown beast. The scream of two shoulder blades, leaving their sheaths, sounded behind him, followed seconds later by two splashes as both her guards were sent overboard in a single twin-leg kick. The assailant lifted his body with just the one arm that had carried his sprung attack. No sign of strain betrayed his body. Shanaki saw only the swiftest blur of this, her instincts focused on escape. She already had one foot on the boat side and was leaping overboard in a jump she hoped would carry her at least halfway to the shore. Before her first foot had fully touched the water's surface, the man had caught her, holding her up by one arm with terrifying ease. She could see the splashes of her guardsmen already swimming toward her, and she made to cry out, but a powdered hand clamped tightly over her mouth and her voice was cut off by a suffocating stench. It crawled down her throat and clawed at her senses. Immediately, her world began to darken. The last thing she saw, as all light faded, was the thud of a sandaled foot against Anake's face.